Okay, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a William Perry Fellow here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and I'll be introducing and moderating today's discussion, which I will remind you, this will be posted and the video will be available in a couple of days' time. But a week ago, we talked about the Russian military buildup near Ukraine, a buildup which has continued over the past week. Today, we're going to look at the diplomacy, is that as the Russian military built up in the end of 2021, the Russians also proposed draft U.S. Russia and NATO-Russia agreements. Now, much in those draft agreements appeared to be unacceptable, and NATO made clear last week that it was not prepared to forswear further enlargement. But some elements might be possible for negotiation when looking at things like constraints on certain types of weapons or military activities in Europe. But the big question looming out there, and this has been looming there really since December when the Russians first publicized these drafts, is does the Kremlin seek a genuine give and take negotiation in which they would set aside their more outlandish demands and also take account of Western concerns? Or are these agreements that were put forward with the intention that they would be rejected in order to provide another pretext for Russian military action against Ukraine? Last week, you had U.S. and Russian officials meeting in Geneva. The NATO-Russia Council met in Brussels, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe met. So the Kremlin has a pretty good idea of what NATO and Western officials believe is negotiable and not negotiable. Now, the latest twist is Secretary of State Blinken will be meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov on Friday in Geneva, and we'll see if that changes anything. But really the focus seems to be is looking to see what will be the next steps coming from Moscow. So to help us understand today where things stand and what might and might not be possible in negotiations with Russia, I'm delighted that we're joined by Rose Gottemoeller and Jim Goldgeier. Rose Gottemoeller is the Stephen C. Házy Lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. She's a former Undersecretary of State for International Security and Arms Control. She was the lead U.S. negotiator for the New START Treaty. But more importantly, for our purposes, she was a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Jim Goldgeier is a visiting scholar here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. He's also a visiting fellow at Brookings, as well as a professor at American University in Washington. And he's written extensively on NATO and Russian security issues. So I'm delighted that we have them here. After each provides some opening comments, we'll open this up to questions. If you do have a question, put it on the Q&A function and we will be following that. So Rose, thank you very much for joining us. Jim as well. Rose, why don't you lead off with what you think we need to know about the diplomacy here?
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you for this opportunity. It's great to be here. I'm actually at Stanford today in Encina Hall, and Jim Goldgeier is right down the corner from me, but we cannot be in the same room or we'd have to have masks on. So I hope for the sake of all of us before too long, we can be gathering together for these excellent seminars that Steve chairs. I really wanted to talk about what might be possible on the road of diplomacy with certain building blocks. And my overarching message to all of us is, I think, if we do get to the point where we have some serious negotiations, I really think we need to depart from the past and think about how to take European security to a new level with some different approaches. And I'll go through building block by building block how I think we should be thinking about that potential future. But it is very much a potential future because, as Steve has just recounted, we're none of us sure if the Russians are themselves in good faith talking about moving forward to negotiations, but instead are headed inevitably down the path of military action. I want to start by mentioning what I thought was a very astute set of comments from Wendy Sherman last week, where she said that this crisis in NATO-Russian and U.S. Russian relations is manufactured. I'm not quoting her directly, but those are the sentiments that she was expressing, and I could not believe more. I could not agree with her more. The United States and NATO are not seeking conflict with Russia. Russia is evidently manufacturing a pretext for conflict with them. And Steve, you used the word with outlandish demands. I think some of them are quite outlandish demands. It's strange and dangerous, and not something that's been mentioned very much, but first and foremost, there has been some nuclear demands out there. Some nuclear brinksmanship is going on. Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov has famously threatened that we are approaching a crisis, quote, even worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, unquote. Today at the Valdai Club, he said that nuclear stability, strategic stability issues, they used to be the most important issues for Russia, but now it is the security guarantees in Europe that they are asking for that are the most important issues for Russia. Well, I've been puzzling what kind of Cuban Missile Crisis he's talking about, except that he also stated in December that Russia is planning to deploy its non-strategic nuclear weapons out of central storage, presumably taking them to operational deployment sites where they could be mated with their delivery systems. If this occurs, it would be a form of nuclear brinksmanship not seen in decades, and certainly not in this crisis. So I think we all have to scratch our heads and ask, why is Russia threatening to go to DEFCON 3? There's no reason for that. Ryabkov has also claimed that if the United States and NATO do not respond to Russian demands, then Russia will cease to implement the New START treaty and remove itself from negotiations to restore the JCPOA. In that case, Moscow would be signaling that it is leaving the now 50-year process of nuclear disarmament with the United States and abandoning cooperative efforts to bring rogue nuclear actors back into the fold of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If the Russians are serious, the implications for nuclear stability and the global non-proliferation regime are dire. Ironically, just weeks after the P5 declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Remember how glad we were about that just a few weeks ago? Well, the Russians seem to be contradicting that idea at the moment. From the perspective of the United States and NATO, we have been trying to keep the temperature down, engaging in good faith negotiating efforts while not giving in to Russian demands regarding NATO enlargement and the future of Ukraine. After last week's talks, my impression is Russia should be ready to take yes for an answer. The United States and NATO have dropped barriers to talking to the Russians about European security, topics the Russians have long been asking for, such as military to military lines of communication, incident response mechanisms, measures to update conventional arms control in Europe, and measures to restore constraints on intermediate range ground-launched missile systems, including with a verification regime. These are stated Russian priorities, including by President Putin himself. So, as I said a moment ago, they should be willing to take yes for an answer. Some points, if we are able to proceed down these paths to negotiation, I think some points are important to stress. And first and foremost, we should not strive to replicate the regimes of the past, INF, CFE, the Open Skies Treaty. The world has changed. Let me say a few words about what I've been calling an INF 2.0. It would not be identical to the structure and obligations of the INF Treaty, which was a global and permanent ban on all intermediate range ground-launched missiles, whether nuclear or conventional. It would have an active monitoring regime to include on-site activities such as confirming the absence of missiles at a base. INF, the demise of which occurred in 2019 after Russian violation of the treaty with the deployment of this missile called the 9M729, in Russian terminology, the SSC-8 in NATO parlance. The INF treaty, though, for many years had not had an active verification regime because the ban inherent in the treaty had been accomplished. All the missiles covered by the treaty had been destroyed by 2001, which is when the last INF on-site inspection occurred. So a new regime would be focused on Europe as a regional restraint regime, but with the proviso that additional regional regimes might be negotiated in the future, especially in Asia. The Chinese might receive impetus to seek such negotiations, given that the Russians had pledged to move all the 9M729 missiles east of the Urals, and the new U.S. ground-launched cruise missile would be ready for deployment in Asia. It's open to question, I think, whether the two parties should seek to ban all intermediate range ground-launched systems in Europe, nuclear and conventional, or focus on banning nuclear systems only. The United States and Russia have gained relevant experience during the New START treaty implementation process, confirming that objects on missiles are conventional only. Therefore, if the ground-based intermediate range missiles left in Europe are conventional only, it should be possible to work out on-site inspection procedures to confirm that fact. However, it is unquestionably more complicated to leave conventional missiles in deployment while nuclear missiles are banned. It is much easier simply to ban all such intermediate range ground-launched missiles from Europe. With regard to conventional forces in Europe, it's less clear if there is a Russian interest in seeking mutual and reciprocal restraint. Russia ceased implementing the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty in 2007 and has not been enthusiastic about modernizing the Vienna document, so-called VDOC, which is a confidence-building regime overseen by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Nevertheless, President Putin has discussed concerns with the deployment of NATO conventional forces close to Russian borders and the operation of air and naval assets in close proximity to Russian airspace and territorial waters. He has asked for a return to 1997 numbers of U.S. forces in Europe, which in my view is ironic, since in 1997, the United States had over 100,000 troops in Europe, and today it has 30,000 fewer troops, or 70,000 in total. For its part, NATO has serious concerns about Russian buildups of conventional forces, most recently against the borders of Ukraine, as well as Russian air and naval operations in close proximity to NATO forces in the Baltic and Black Seas. Therefore, there should be shared interest in exploring a regime of mutual and reciprocal restraint, which we might call CFE 2.0. Again, a new regime's general characteristics are clearly visible. The new regime should not be identical to CFE by any means. It became seriously out of date when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. Likewise, it should not be identical to the adapted CFE treaty, which aimed to rectify this problem but never was entered into force. The key difference is the lack of a need to consider new reductions in conventional forces in Europe. The enormous conventional buildup of the Cold War years has been eliminated, and neither NATO nor the Russian Federation nor any other states parties to the former regimes will want to reduce under new ceilings. In any case, Russia and all NATO members are below the adapted CFE treaty limits on tanks, armored combat vehicles, artillery, attack helicopters, and combat aircraft. Therefore, the focus of the new regime should be on creating mutual predictability in border areas so that troop, weapon, and equipment buildups cannot occur without warning. The basic assumption should be thin military forces in border areas, with routine border control and patrol being maintained by border troops, coast guards, and civilian airspace authorities. Measures to constrain reinforcement capability may also make sense to deploy. In fact, I think they would make sense to explore. Of course, this would be tricky, as it will generally be easier for Russians to reinforce using internal lines such as railways rather than for NATO. At a minimum, measures to create additional warning and predictability about reinforcement should be explored. Monitoring and verification should be an aspect of the regime in order to ensure compliance, but also as a confidence and predictability enhancing measure. In this regard, on-site inspection should be re-established as a routine practice. It's a practice that has gone begging with the problems in implementation of the CFE regime, although I will say inspections are still taking place under CFE, just not in Russia. I would like to end with a brief pitch to rethink that other regime dogged by patchy Russian implementation, the Open Skies Treaty. Famously unpopular in the U.S. Department of Defense because of resource costs, lack of a clear home, as well as concerns about Russian compliance, it's time to think again about the confidence building value of that regime. At a time when most military confidence building was disappearing from Europe, NATO allies and partners saw Open Skies as an increasingly valuable way to sustain some confidence building relationship with the Russian military. They fly on NATO missions. NATO countries fly on their missions. So they are all together during these flights of the Open Skies inspection process. I think we also need to examine whether it's possible that we could think about an Open Skies 2.0, whether that's worth considering. Again, it would not be the same as Open Skies. We would not be purchasing our own US aircraft, but leasing aircraft for missions. We could depend on off-the-shelf cameras and equipment instead of taking on the expense of building unique and single-purpose ones. Perhaps we could broaden the Open Skies concept so that it may be used for other purposes, such as cooperative environmental monitoring in the Arctic, thus bringing the resources of more government agencies or even private sector organizations to bear. In all of these cases, I urge us all, let's think forward and not back, always insisting on compliance with commitments, not forgetting the difficulties we've had with Russian compliance in the past, but thinking about ways to truly have some negotiated restraint and constraints in Europe. That all depends, as we've been saying, on where the Russians' heads are at this moment. Is it all about moving toward the negotiating table or away from it and into crisis and perhaps conflict? I certainly hope not, but we shall have to see. Thank you, Steve, for this opportunity. Over to you. I look forward to hearing what Jim has to say.
Thank you. Jim, let me give you the mic now.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and great to be with everybody. Great to be here at Stanford. So I just wanted to build a little bit on what Rose was talking about, and just first really sort of separate out these issue areas where a real negotiation could take place, as she's just been discussing. And if Putin wanted to have those negotiations, as Rose put it, if he wanted to take yes for an answer, he could have those negotiations on issues like missile deployments, on size and scale of military exercises, on what she was just talking about with respect to border areas, other confidence building measures, and those really speak to the question of sort of what are the legitimate security concerns that countries have, that NATO countries have, that Ukraine has, that Russia has. These countries all have security concerns, and there's certainly a willingness within NATO to have a conversation on those issues. The other question, the Minsk Accords, to really provide a settlement to the Ukraine, the civil war that Putin has fostered, and have an agreement on the status of those areas in eastern Ukraine that he would like to see enshrined with greater autonomy. Maybe harder to get that than these other issues, but that's also something that's ripe for negotiation. The question is, what about these other things that he put out there in December and that the Russians have continued to put out? These big ticket items, basically, asking NATO to admit that everything it's done since 1997 with respect to including new members and providing their security was wrong. Having NATO sign a document saying it will never take Ukraine and other former Soviet states in as a member. These were sort of the big ticket, big headline items, and the question is, are they there because the West will say no and it gives Putin a pretext to move militarily, or are they there to try to create leverage for these other areas where negotiations are possible? And what we've seen so far would be consistent with either theory. So it's hard to know yet what it is. And then, of course, we've been talking about these issues related to European security broadly. If what he really wants is for Ukraine to fail as an independent, successful democracy, if he really wants regime change in Ukraine, then these other issues don't really matter to him as much as moving against the country. For those who don't know the background on this issue about NATO membership and this question of Ukraine, as well as Georgia, but for this conversation, Ukraine, the ostensible reason for these kinds of demands is continued Russian anger over the 2008 NATO Bucharest Summit declaration that declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. It was not a wise thing for NATO to do. We could talk about it if people want. It was a compromise because the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, wanted membership action plans, the concrete process for Ukraine and Georgia, and France and Germany opposed. And this was compromise language that really was not wise. But it's also the case that Ukraine is not on a path to NATO membership. There is no near-term possibility of that. But at the same time, NATO is not going to formally close a door that the original 1949 treaty opens to all European countries that meet the criteria and can contribute to alliance security. And so again, that gets to this question of, if NATO is not going to formally close the door, why would Putin publicly ask for it? And why would he ask that the US and NATO provide a public written response to these demands. And I think we don't know yet whether that's designed as a pretext for going in, or whether it's to create more opportunities. Certainly in the proposed treaty with the United States, in addition to wanting to formally close the door, there were demands to limit military deployments and agreement on intermediate short-range ground-launched missiles once U.S. nuclear weapons withdrawn from Europe. And in his proposed treaty with NATO, he's asking that deployments from what we call the old members, the 16 who were there at the end of the Cold War, that deployments from old members to the newer members cease. And same with military activity in Ukraine, the Caucasus, in Central Asia. So again, he's not going to get the US and NATO to go back to a pre-1997 world, but he can get other agreements, as Rose has outlined. And the United States and NATO are fully prepared to have these conversations. And what we saw in the discussions last week, there were the U.S. Russia conversations, the NATO Russia conversations, the OSCE conversations. And again, this week we'll have further conversations, including between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister on Friday. And at times the Russians have indicated that nothing matters but these big ticket, the big ticket promise never to enlarge, to include Ukraine. And at other times, there's been, reference to constructive nature of the talks. I just want to mention one final issue before we open it up, and that is there a framework or some kind of new architecture for European security that could address Russian security concerns? We often see this discussed, that there needs to be some kind of new European security architecture that would include the Russians and would be more congenial for Russians and deal with Russian security interests compared to what currently exists. And I if somebody has an idea of what that looks like, I would love to hear it. I just don't know what that could be. Basically what you have is you have NATO, which has sought a formal relationship with Russia since the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, and has sought to create mechanisms for having conversations between NATO and Russia. And certainly there is there are issues from the Russian perspective. They're not members of NATO. A NATO-Russia meeting means there are 30 members of NATO, and then there's Russia. So that clearly is a challenge. But you also have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that does include all of the European countries. And the OSCE was created in 1994 out of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And it was done because the Russians wanted an organization to replace something that was more informal. And that was what they were hoping would provide some greater architecture. Because of the OSCE role in election monitoring, the Russians have soured on the OSCE. So they're not as happy about having the OSCE as they thought they might be in 1994. And I think that the other problem when we talk about European security architecture and an organization like the OSCE is that it puts Russia on an equal footing, but that means it's on an equal footing with large and small states alike. And the Russians don't seem to want to be on an equal footing with small states. What they really seem to want, what they've indicated in the comments, in their comments regarding the U.S. Russia negotiations that took place last week, in the comments about the U.S. Russia conversations that are going to take place later this week, in initial reactions to the proposal floated by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, today, that there should be a new conversation between the EU and Russia, because after all, the EU was left out of the negotiations last week, because the EU really isn't a player on these security issues. And the Russians in an ideal world for them, seem to want a U.S. Russia conversation that solves everything, puts them on an equal footing with the United States, and takes care of all of European security issues. And that's just not going to happen. The US and Russia are able to have these big high-level bilateral conversations on arms control, which involve the US and Russian nuclear arsenals. But on the broader issues of European security, this can't be done by the US and Russia alone. And the US, of course, has been very clear about that. You know, they're not going to, not about Europe without Europe, not about Ukraine without Ukraine. I mean, the US isn't going to go for that. So it just seems to me that a new architecture that goes beyond NATO, Russia, that goes beyond OSCE in terms of some kind of institutional framework, I just don't see what that would be. And I think ideally the focus would be where Rose put it, which is on serious, concrete efforts to manage particular issues like conventional forces, like intermediate range nuclear forces, like size and scale of military exercises, like deployment, the location of deployments, and so on. Those are concrete conversations that can be had, and the United States and its NATO partners are eager to have those. And so the question remains: is Putin? Would Putin be satisfied with those kinds of conversations, or does he really want something else, namely a change in government in Ukraine, or Ukraine really more folded in or parts of Ukraine folded in to the Russian Federation or annexed in the way Crimea was in 2014? If he wants the latter things, then that's not something that the United States and Ukraine are prepared to go along with. And so we're going to end up in a situation where we're trying to deter Russian behavior, make Russian behavior costly, and punish Russia if it does go forward with any kind of additional military invasion beyond what it's already done.
Thank you, Jim. Rose, you wanted to make one other comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to do a quick two-finger, Jim, because I did take exception with one thing you said. Everything else was excellent, of course, but you said Ukraine is not on a path to NATO membership. Now, you did say anytime soon, but I did want to stress that from NATO's perspective, I'm talking with my old DSG hat on now, from NATO's perspective, Ukraine was and is indeed on a path to NATO membership. NATO spends a lot of time working with Ukraine. NATO member states spend a lot of time working with Ukraine to try to get them moving along the path of reform and take the steps they will need to do to restructure their armed forces, put more civilian control over the military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's just a lot that is going on. So I didn't want it to seem that somehow NATO and Ukraine are not in constant contact, not working together steadily. They are. I agree. It's the question, how long is the path going to be? And that's what the Ukrainians don't like, that there's that uncertainty. They don't know how long the path is going to be, but they are, in NATO parlance, on the path to membership.
Actually, Rose, let me pose a question. Would it be fair to say that while Ukraine is on the path to membership, that at this point in time, there does not appear to be a lot of enthusiasm within NATO for making that an accelerated path?
Well, one thing I learned when I was at NATO is that there is, people are always grasping for the map, for example, the membership action plan, and the various meetings come and go, and the Ukrainian government demands its map sooner rather than later. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean a country is ready for membership or more close to membership if it's got a map. Bosnia and Herzegovina is also on that list of NATO aspirants. People forget about them. They've had a map forever. But everybody recognizes there are many, many difficulties also with that country. Nevertheless, it remains on the list of NATO aspirants, and I do hope that its political situation can right itself somehow, of course, with a lot of help from its neighbors. But in any event, I do like to say that pay attention to the work that's going on rather than the next document that everybody wants to see signed.
Okay. Let me throw out a question. Maybe this would be for you, Jim. Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian deputy foreign minister, has said quite a bit over the last week, and his comments are not always consistent with comments he made the day before. But today he made a comment which was that, well, we may not need a NATO-Russia agreement on no enlargement, but we just need an agreement from the United States, which of course, any decision to admit a new member would require consensus. We just need the United States to agree that the United States would never agree to admit any other country. Does that change things? I mean, that doesn't seem to, and what might be behind that? It seems sort of a, fairly naked proposal that doesn't really alter the game from where things were last week.
Well, yes, and it's also, I mean, it would be hugely damaging to NATO for the United States to say that it was going to stake out a position that wasn't worked out with the other members. And I think, of course, this is one of the Russian goals, which is to try to stoke division within NATO. And of course, one of the American goals in return is to try to keep NATO unified. I think that, that's one of the issues with the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, which is still the consensus declaration. I mean, that language, that was agreed to in 2008. If you were going to say something other than Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, you would need a new consensus on new language. And, that would be quite difficult to achieve, to get all 30 countries to agree to new language. And I think, I just can't imagine a situation under which the United States would say to the Russians, fine, we'll agree that that we won't support Ukrainian membership, because it really would be going behind the backs of the other NATO members. I mean, the other thing to mention on this, it was either in I think it was in 1997. Boris Yeltsin asked Bill Clinton for a gentleman's agreement, private agreement between the two of them, that the United States would not take Ukraine into NATO. And, even like, we could go into a closet and shake hands on it. No one will ever know, but and Bill Clinton said, I can't do that. That's not something that I can do. And he referenced, in large part, he referenced American domestic politics, that the Congress would have quite a few problems with an American president going into a closet with the Russian president and making that, that sort of that gentleman's agreement. So the Ryabkov statement certainly has been tried before, and I just don't see that as a path. But it is a reminder that, again, the Russians, they're most eager to have a Russia-US agreement about European security and about all these issues, and really aren't that interested in having other countries involved in that conversation.
And I think that is a very good observation, that one of the Russian goals here is to try to drive a wedge between the United States and its European allies. Let me ask a very short question for both of you. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very good coordination and consultation and 1 being poor, how would you rate the consultations and the ability of the United States and Europe to present a unified front? 1 being bad, 5 being good.
Well, if 5 is just good, I would say 5 is what I would give them. The administration's worked really hard to keep everybody in the loop. If 5 is superlative, then I'd probably say a 4. But in any event, I have been impressed with the way that Washington's been trying to keep NATO in the loop, and vice versa. I guess where the breakdowns occurred is between the EU and the entities in NATO, perhaps. I don't know, I'm just reading the media, and also the United States. But that seems to be improving as well. So I guess I would give it a 4. I don't know, Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they've done a really good job. I mean, I think in terms of the way they went into these negotiations last week and what's come out since then, I guess I would put them at a 5. And Blinken's trip this week, Secretary of State Blinken's trip this week, I think that they're doing a good job. The interesting thing to ask, which I don't know, the issue that arose last year with respect to Afghanistan was the U.S. kept saying, we are consulting, we are talking to the Europeans. And the European response was, well, you're telling us what you're planning to do, which is not the same as consulting. Consulting means you would talk to us and we would share with you where we think things should go, and we'd actually have a real conversation. And the US was basically just saying, here's what we've decided. And of course, we saw what happened in Afghanistan last summer. My sense is that the administration did learn from that experience and is doing better with respect to actual consultations. But I think that would be the real thing to ask would be, is consultation just the US informing, or is the US having real discussions with real give and take? And then the only last thing I would just mention is just the German foreign minister in her press conference with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday, I think did a spectacular job and really helped the situation with respect to NATO's relations with Russia and Germany's relations with the United States.
Great. Okay, let me start taking questions here. Let me note that on the Q&A function, actually, you have to enter your question into that function, not just indicate that you want to pose a question, because we don't have the ability to bring people live on. Or if we do, I am not technically competent enough to run it and figure it out. Okay, Scott Sagan from CSAC poses the question. Sergei Ryabkov told Russian state television on January 13 that he could neither confirm nor exclude the potential unspecified military deployments that Russia might make to Cuba and Venezuela. Russian media followed up on that with remarks with a report that the agents from Russia's spy agency, the FSB, that's the successor to the KGB, had visited both Cuba and Venezuela in recent days. So how worried should we be that the Russians might say, look, you Americans are putting military force into the Baltic region. We are now going to put Russian military force or capabilities into places such as Cuba or Venezuela?
Well, maybe I'll start here. It's interesting, but Russian strategic bombers have long been visiting Cuba and Venezuela, and so the United States keeps a sharp eye on that, of course, and has fighter escorts and that type of thing. I've read in a very recent article that, in fact, it's seen as a little bit of a rest cure for the bomber crews, that they get to go to Cuba and rest for a while on the beach before having to fly back. So it's a little bit of a more or less enjoyable thing for them. But I think there are those precedents already out there. Certainly, Russia has been selling military equipment to Venezuela, not so much to Cuba these days, although the history is solid in that regard. So in some ways, I think we have to look for something new at this point, Scott. Certainly, if what they are talking about as a return to the Cuban Missile Crisis would be to bring new, very capable missiles into Cuba or Venezuela, that would be, really an issue to do more than keep a sharp eye on. But I don't believe there's any evidence of that up to this point. And we have out there, as I said, this Putin proposal to begin to deal with the 9M729 in Europe, to begin to restore some constraints on intermediate range missiles. So rather than throwing threats around, let's get down to the talks. Let's sit down at the table and start fleshing out this Putin proposal and see if we can turn it into a real negotiation. But that would be certainly my advice. But at the moment, I'm not particularly panicked at the remark that there may be some new equipment or weapons coming in. We just have to watch it carefully.
Okay, let me pose the next question now that Cuba has come up. Michael Crepon asks, might the Kremlin be seeking something like a Cuban Missile Crisis type resolution, where, of course, there was this private agreement, never publicized, that if the Russians pulled the missiles out of Cuba, the United States would retire and withdraw the old Jupiter missiles from Turkey. So is Russia trying to get that kind of agreement? Russia won't invade or re-invade Ukraine, and Ukraine won't become a member on the sly with, say, the United States. And if that's their goal, what is the possibility that in fact might be realized?
Well, that's why I raised the issue that came up in the 1990s with Yeltsin asking for this gentleman's agreement, and wanting to go into the closet with Clinton and shake his hand on it. I mean, I think what the West can do, it's not easy because you got to be careful, but I mean, given that Ukraine, I heard what Rose said about that technically it is on a path to membership, but from my perspective, I mean, this is not a country that's going to become a member of NATO anytime in the foreseeable future. And it's certainly not on a, she also, excellent point on the whole membership action plan issue, but still, it's not going to become a member anytime in the foreseeable future. And, can that be conveyed to the Russians more than it has been? Are there ways to say it? I mean, I think there probably are. The other question is, in some kind of diplomatic negotiation, could there be language reached that finds some way to compromise where Ukraine isn't going to become a member of NATO anytime soon, but the door isn't formally closed? I mean, since it's not going to be, it would seem like there would be a way to have a conversation about that kind of language. But in terms of, would Joe Biden be willing to go into a closet with Putin and say, you have my word, Ukraine will never become a member of NATO? I just don't see that happening. And I also don't really know what it would mean anyway for, a lot of the discussion about the conversations that were had in 1990 between James Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev, rest on these comments that were made between these two, the U.S. Secretary of State and the Soviet General Secretary that were made in 1990. And, what would it mean anyway, even if you had the current two leaders, and certainly in the case of a U.S. president who isn't going to be around forever, even if Vladimir Putin is, what would it mean for a U.S. president to say something like that anyway? I just don't see how that would happen in this case.
Steve, could I add a quick word on this?
Please.
The only thing that I think is possible in this regard is a kind of no surprises pledge, because in actual fact, when a country is preparing to join NATO, it does take time for consensus to gather around that country, around the NATO North Atlantic Council, the NAC table. It takes time, and steps have to be gone through, hoops have to be jumped through. And in some cases, there are very clear steps, but you can see then when consensus starts to gather. And the example I will give you all is the recent example of the Republic of North Macedonia and its name dispute with Greece, but also its border disputes with Bulgaria and Albania. And slowly but surely, over a period of some years, with a lot of political courage on the part of the politicians in the region, the leaders in the region, they worked through the necessary agreements so that step by step, the Republic of North Macedonia, the consensus for their entry into NATO was gathered around the NAC table. It took time, and it took some really significant steps for that to happen. So I think that to the extent Russia's concerned about eventual membership for Ukraine and Georgia, what I could say is there will be no surprises here, because in effect, they have to go through a series of steps, and there will be warning when consensus is beginning to gather about around their membership. So that's the only way I can think about it. I certainly would not make any kind of secret agreements or anything like that. I just don't think that is well, I can't think of a strong enough word. I don't think that's relevant, but I feel stronger about it than that. I simply would not go down that road.
Okay. Michael May asked the question, to what extent do Russian internal politics constrain what Putin can do? I mean, he staked out in a very strong and a very public way these key demands that NATO forswear further enlargement, that NATO withdraw forces from the territory of allies who joined the alliance after 1997. If he pulls back now and accepts a negotiation on the terms that NATO seemed to outline regarding things like weapon systems and confidence rebuilding measures, would that be a problem for him publicly or with the armed forces or his security forces?
Well, fortunately for him, he controls the media, so he has the ability to spin this however he wants. And I think, this does get to the broader question of how much of domestic politics are figuring into his calculations. There's a lot of discussion, and our Stanford colleague, Catherine Stoner, had a great piece in the Wall Street Journal on Putin's domestic calculations with respect to his declining popularity in recent years, and sort of what he needs to do to try to regain some of that. And we certainly saw in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea that he had a big popularity boost that has eroded. But so there's the question of, okay, what does he gain politically if he does invade Ukraine again? And it seems there like a lot of dead Russians aren't going to help him politically that much. So that's why I have been puzzled from the outset as to how much of another invasion would really help him politically. But with respect to sort of a notion that he was backing down in some way, I think if there's a real negotiation and there's efforts along the lines that Rose suggested, and that addressed some real security concerns that the Russian has, I think he could paint it that he finally got the West and the United States to pay attention to Russian security concerns, and he got something for it. And given the way he controls the media in Russia, I think he could certainly present that, if that's what he wanted to do.
Okay. Sugar Dupieri asks, is there a reason why the Kremlin feels emboldened to raise these demands now? Rose, you used the term a manufactured crisis, and I think that's the correct term here. So the question is, why now? What was the calculation in the Kremlin that made the end of 2021 the time to begin this crisis, as opposed to, say, 2 years ago or 2 years from now?
I'm afraid I don't have a good answer on this one. I've been puzzling over it myself. Jim might have a better answer. I do think it's odd timing in many ways, and just to again raise this issue for this group. It may be a little bit funny to think about, but if a Ukrainian invasion goes forward in the coming weeks, this is going to be the second time that Putin has messed up the Beijing Olympics, and I'm wondering, isn't he concerned about his buddy Xi Jinping? I say this only partially in jest, because I myself have been wondering whether, Xi, of course, he and Putin are doing a lot in harmony. I was a bit surprised about how clearly they were arm in arm over the Kazakhstan crisis a couple of weeks ago, although they have different interests in Kazakhstan, but they're not showing daylight between each other. But I'm wondering if, Xi Jinping might have some concerns here about how far and how fast Putin is going to destabilize the situation in Europe. Now, people say, well, that could be an opportunity for him to proceed with destabilization in Asia. But, he's got to be concerned about his economy and the markets in Europe and so forth and so forth and so forth. So you can weigh it either way, but I really am having a hard time seeing the reason for it now for this manufactured crisis. Jim, can you do any better than I?
Well, yeah, I think I do think what your point is, that the day we should be worried about is the day after the Olympics have concluded. But I think this does get to the point, people have been asking the question, is Putin doing this because he sees the United States that's determined to be preoccupied with China and, doesn't really want to deal with these issues in Eastern Europe, and so maybe more amenable to cutting a deal? Is he doing this because he thinks Joe Biden is weak? I think the likelier explanation is that there's a domestic component to this within Russia, but also sort of his views on what's taking place in Ukraine. And Steve, you'd be better placed to answer this, but it seems that he's very frustrated with Ukrainian President Zelensky, that he hasn't, things haven't worked out the way he was hoping they would with Zelensky agreeing with an implementation of the Minsk Accords, that Zelensky has moved against some individuals in Ukraine who are very close to Putin, and that basically the sort of why now rather than wait is that the longer he waits, the more difficult the situation gets, the farther along he is to sort of losing Ukraine, that you're going to have more Western support for Ukraine, and so that it's sort of now's the moment. But I think it has more to do with things going on inside of Russia and inside of Ukraine, and so the notion that's often expressed that he sees a weak U.S. president, or he sees a U.S. president that wants to focus on China, those just don't seem as compelling to me.
Yeah, I just briefly add on the question of Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is moving away from Moscow, but my observation would be that nothing has done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than Russian policy of the past 8 years, the seizure of Crimea, the provoking and then sustaining the conflict in Donbass, which has killed more than 13,000 people. And this is where, again, I don't understand Vladimir Putin's logic at times, but I don't see how a Russian military invasion of Ukraine now would change the desires of the Ukrainians to be more closely anchored in the West. Edith poses the question, some have suggested that a solution might be neutrality for Austria, or neutrality for Ukraine, in the same way that there was the state treaty on Austrian neutrality. Would that be an acceptable solution?
It's an excellent question, Ed, but I am smiling here because there are a number of countries on the borderlands of Russia who have adopted neutrality as their national policies, but have also become very strong partners of NATO and very effective and efficient partners in terms of their interoperability with NATO, their cooperation across the board. And at least two of them, Finland and Sweden, whom I never thought would have the public support for NATO membership, their publics are beginning to really articulate more support for NATO membership, again, because of Russian behavior. So it's Russia that is driving the momentum against neutrality rather than toward neutrality along its borderlands. And I would hope that is a message that the Kremlin would take on board, because honestly, these kinds of suggestions I've seen emanating from Russian experts as well recently. And it's, to my mind, one has only to look at Russia's behavior right now and to see the reactions in places like Helsinki and Stockholm to realize that the momentum seems to be heading in the opposite direction, away from neutrality.
Okay, Susan Wasalko asked the question, how does it affect the prospect for a country's membership in NATO when it has border issues? I mean, in the case of Ukraine, you have Russia has seized and illegally occupied Crimea. You have Russian military forces in Donbass. How does that complicate a prospective member's ability to join the alliance?
Well, I should let Rose answer, given her former position at NATO. But I just say, from my perspective, having studied this issue for a long time, it does make it very difficult. And I think we saw that in 2008 with the outcome of the war between Russia and Georgia. And NATO, since the 90s, has talked about exporting stability as opposed to importing instability. And it doesn't want to have countries in the alliance where there are territorial disputes and where you have the kind of situation that you do with Russia in Eastern Ukraine. I think the Russians know that. And that really was, even though that really wasn't an issue that was sort of formally part of the whole NATO enlargement process early on, it was something that President Barack Obama made clear when he came into office in 2009. So it definitely shapes the conversation.
However, and I'll just add here, I agree with everything Jim said, but I will add and go back to my example of the Republic of North Macedonia. There were serious disputes there with its bordering neighbors, all members of NATO. And so Skopje had to solve those problems. So, you know, the door is open, and presumably the door is open in other cases as well. Well, one exception, of course, is that West Germany entered NATO. That was a special exception. People see it as a special exception and sometimes say, well, maybe there could be that kind of option for Ukraine. Again, it's all dependent on how consensus gathers around the NAC table. And so countries are asked to, you know, do certain things to resolve certain problems before the consensus can gather. And I think the one comment I'll make is that NATO has had some flexible approaches historically. A lot of, there's a lot of potential for movement, but I'm not, and I don't want to suggest that the West Germany model is one to pursue here, but only to say there have been different precedents set in the past. It shows that NATO has had some creativity and flexibility in the past in how it thinks about these things. But the most important issue for Ukraine is to work with the NATO member states to build that consensus over time. So that is what Kiev has to keep its focus on, keep its eye on going forward.
Okay, let me combine two questions here. One question comes from Paul Meyer, and that is, should we look at what the Russians have done really as an attention-grabbing device, a way that allows them to sort of demonstrate the world that they are a great power, that they have interests, and that they have the weight to push those interests? Is that, how much of that explains what the Russians have done? And then on the other side, Sig Hecker asks, can you think of some other event or crisis that somehow might derail this manufactured crisis that Putin has created with regards to NATO and Ukraine?
Yeah, both, very interesting questions. I mean, on the latter, I mean, just think about sort of what people were wondering when you had the eruption and the protests in Kazakhstan, and the fighting among the elites in Kazakhstan and the Russian deployments to Kazakhstan, and people wondering whether that would, what would that mean for the situation in Ukraine? Would Russia, need to become so much more involved in Kazakhstan that it took away from what it was doing in Ukraine? And certainly a lot of people have, tried to make these connections between the Russians in Ukraine and the Chinese in Taiwan. And I don't think there's any kind of Chinese move on Taiwan imminent. So I don't think that's an issue, but, just imagine, some kind of flashpoint there, for example, and how that would perhaps change the contours of this particular crisis. On the attention grabbing, I would just say, I think it's really important. When I look at those documents that the Russians put forward, it's just an expression of the kind of real grievances that they have that have built up over so many years. And grievances really in large part due to Russia's weakness at the end of the Cold War, the ability of the United States and NATO to set the terms of the post-Cold War security environment in Europe, the security settlement in Europe. The effort was made to include the Russians. I mean, I think it's important for people to remember that the goal after the end of the Cold War was not to exclude the Russians, but to find ways to try to stabilize Central and Eastern Europe, but also to reach out to Russia, to address Russian security concerns, to give Russia a voice, even if it didn't have a veto. And I think what you're seeing in this sort of, Putin display and the attention grabbing of, I want to go back to the world before 1997 and then have a redo, is just the anger that he has about the way things have developed in Europe since then, and an effort any way he can to see if he can undermine the unity of the West, even though what he ends up doing is creating more unity in the West. And Steve, you were mentioning, what he's done to Ukrainian politics and support in Ukraine for being part of the West, for joining NATO, something that didn't exist prior to his invasion in 2014. And what he also does is unify NATO. I mean, absent his aggression, NATO would have a lot harder time maintaining its unity. He would, if what he really wants is to undermine NATO unity, he would do a lot better to be putting out olive branches rather than, bolstering troops on the border with Ukraine or moving troops into Belarus. He's the one that, just as he's done with Ukrainian sentiment, he's the one that enables NATO to remain unified.
Okay, let me pivot now. We have about 15 minutes left. You've both said that there were some elements of the Russian draft agreements that might provide a basis for discussion and even negotiation. And there are a number of questions from the audience on that. So John Woodworth, who helped negotiate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, asks, and I'll direct this question at you, Rose, the advantages of having an agreement that would ban nuclear armed intermediate range missiles in Europe as opposed to banning all intermediate range missiles in Europe.
Thank you, John. And it's really great to have you on this call, the voice of experience. Well, I think there are a number of reasons to consider whether we can go at this with a little more, I'm not going to say finesse, because of course the INF treaty was a treaty that was filled with finesse, but we have the option now of allowing conventionally armed intermediate range missiles to go free, so to say, either to be limited in some ways or just to go completely free and then ban the nuclear armed systems. It's what we sometimes call putting the N back in INF, because the INF treaty was called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, but it banned all such missiles because we could not distinguish. Now we are at a point, again, I think thanks to the techniques that we worked out in implementation of reentry vehicle on-site inspection in the New START treaty, we have techniques available that can allow us to confirm the absence of nuclear warheads on the front ends of such missiles. So would that be in the defense and security interest of the United States? Since the United States has said we only plan to deploy conventionally armed missiles in Europe in that range, it certainly would be in the U.S. Interest, I would think. But here we'll have, I'm sure, some objections from the Russian side. So it may, in the end of the day, not be possible, but in the end of the day, they may see a defense and security interest for having some conventionally armed missiles in those ranges continuing to be deployed in Europe. So I think we still have, obviously, a good deal of exploration to do because, again, Putin put this more, I would say, useful proposal on the table in October of 2020, much more useful than the initial so-called moratorium proposal, which was very one-sided and only directed at the United States, but now pledging to take the 9M729 out of Europe and put in place a verification regime to ensure it stays out of Europe. I think it opens up the possibility of a true exploration that could lead to some very productive negotiations. So by the way, that is an aspect of the Russian agreements that I think is worth exploring, whether there are some ways we can limit missile deployments in Europe.
Okay, Tom Finger asks, if you got into this conversation on both the question of missiles in Europe, but also on confidence and security building measures, what might be some of the really tough issues? I mean, if say the Russians set aside their outlandish demands and you have this sort of discussion that NATO seems prepared to have, what would be the difficult issues between NATO and Russia?
Well, I'll just dive in quickly with my top line, and that is the non-compliance problems of the past. And that is what is, as a matter of fact, has kept the United States, and I think many NATO allies, from really being willing to talk to the Russians about refurbishing the conventional arms control regimes. As I mentioned in my remarks, it was the Russians who ceased implementing CFE in 2007 rather. It's the Russians who have been playing fast and loose with the VDOC, Vienna Document Confidence Building measures. It's the Russians who have a patchy implementation history on open skies. So I think that will be right at the top of the list in terms of figuring out, can we come to a point of having some substantive measures here with also some monitoring and verification implementation measures associated with them so that we can be assured that they are being implemented.
And I would just add, I think from a Russian standpoint, a big issue will be sort of what kinds of NATO deployments in the Eastern members are tolerable. Again, Steve, to your earlier point about post-2014, the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act there was an agreement you wouldn't have permanent stationing. We ended up with rotating deployments because the West needed to do something to reassure its Eastern members, and you've had more and more sort of larger exercises and efforts at that reassurance, and see in the draft treaty that Russia doesn't want any deployments from the West into the East, and I just can't imagine that's something that NATO could agree to. So then the question would be sort of what would there be, what would be possible to agree to? But I would imagine those would be some difficult conversations, at least with respect to the levels of troops that are rotating through.
Okay, Amy Wolf and Ann Clunan pose variations of the same question, which is, at the end of the day, the kind of negotiation that you've suggested NATO would be prepared to engage in, does that offer enough for Putin, given what he's done and said? And could he use that as a face-saving way out of a corner which he seems to have painted himself into over the last couple of months?
Rose, you want me to go? I mean, I think, he could. He could take any of these things as a face saving. I mean, again, especially given, his control over the media within Russia, he can paint this out however he wants. Is it enough? I just don't think we know yet. And if what he really wants is that formal, written, public guarantee that Ukraine is not going to become a member of NATO, he's not going to get that. Presumably, he knows he's not going to get that. So that does raise this question. So why did he ask for it? Did he ask for it because he wants to, he believes that it shows that the West is obstinate and they won't in fact pay attention to what he considers to be legitimate Russian security concerns, and so that if he can put the West on record as opposing or rejecting his demands, that then he has a pretext to go in, or is it to be able to say, well, this was the way to get their attention and to bring them to the table? I think the thing to watch for, it's a good sign that Secretary of State Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov are meeting on Friday, and I think a big signal will be, are talks then scheduled to follow on from the talks that are taking place Friday, or do the Russians say, West has had its chance and it hasn't come through, and we're done talking? I think as long as they keep talking, I think that's a possible way out of this crisis.
My view of this is that again, the building blocks are there, the parts and pieces are there to put together into a package that Putin could say, yeah, this shows the West is serious about enhancing European security in our interest. We've had to keep stressing to them it's mutual and reciprocal interest, so we will have to continue to stress that message, I think. I don't think it's going to be enough, though. I do think that this aspect of symmetry is going to have to continue to be a factor in progress here, obviously. And this is a remark that responds to an earlier question as to why they're doing this in such a highly visible way. Well, the Russian Federation has been on the front pages of newspapers and in the nightly news every day now for 6 weeks. That had not been happening for a long, long time. I think that's what part of what Putin likes, is that he's back on the global stage. Again, he's bestride the global stage in a way where he appears to be in a dominant position. He likes that. It's self-affirming for him as a leader. It also, for the Russian public, helps to affirm his position, I suppose. But that does mean that symmetry has to play a role here. I think President Biden's actually done a pretty good job in pursuing symmetry. The question is, can there be a package put together now that includes the building blocks I've been talking about that we all think could make for some good and useful negotiations? with some other big package with a bow on it, something like Putin has wanted this P5 summit meeting to take place since 2020, and it was agreed to at the time, then COVID got in the way. So could the P5, President Biden perhaps taking the lead, agree to go forward again with this P5 summit meeting on the back of the P5 statement about nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought? You know, some kind of big box with a bow on it that would then make an additional face saver for President Putin. So I do think that there are ways to go about it, but it does mean the president. And as we've seen, the leaders of other countries in Europe are going to have to put their efforts into it. And it does mean Russia's going to stay on the front page of the newspaper or on the nightly news for some time to come, I think.
Okay, Scott Bade poses the question. Actually, several have asked this question. You both correctly, in my view, gave fairly high marks to transatlantic consultations over the last several weeks. But looking at individual allies, Foreign Minister Baerbock had, I think, a pretty good visit to Moscow, but there have been some mixed signals coming over the last week out of Berlin with regards to how vulnerable Nord Stream 2 would be if there were a Russian military attack. French President Macron has been now talking about, carving out a role for the European Union. How would you say Washington should be concerned about the ability to sustain this front when you have allies which seem to be taking slightly different nuances as they talk about this crisis?
Well, at least Macron is consistent. He's been pushing the EU forward forever, so that's fine. It's in line with his position about European strategic autonomy. I don't really see the cracks right at the moment. I know that the potential is there with Nord Stream, but I really do see a lot of NATO solidarity at the moment, and partially it's because of something the United States did toward the beginning of this period, and that is the NATO allies in Europe took fright at the notion that the United States would be engaging bilaterally. And so all of a sudden the NATO-Russia Council looked kind of attractive, and that has drawn the NATO allies together anyway around the notion that they need to be working together and working then in the NATO-Russia Council to try to get Russia to negotiate. So to me, the cohesion looks good at the moment. And I don't see those kinds of threats on the horizon right now. Jim?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the Macron statements today, was it, the EU was left out last week and he doesn't like that. And he, wants the EU to play a more serious role. He doesn't like the fact that what the Russians really want is U.S. Russia conversations. I think his comments about a European role are going to be more problematic for him than they are going to be for the United States, because, if he wants that European role, he's got to have others who want to join him in Europe. And he's had a hard time ever since became president with, he has leadership aspirations in Europe, and you've got to have followers if you're going to have that kind of leadership role. So that's a challenge for him. And the German situation, you have a new chancellor. The comments seem to differ on a sort of regular basis. I do think the German foreign minister, Baerbock, is really showing clear strengths in that role. And the chancellor, has sort of seems to have come around to saying the right things on this. Nord Stream 2 is just a really difficult issue because, Germans have really wanted to go forward with Nord Stream 2, and not going forward with it does have costs.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're just about the end. I'm going to pose two quick questions. The first question, we have on Friday Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov meeting, although Secretary Blinken has already said he's not bringing a written set of counter proposals to what the Russians tabled in December and what was discussed last week. How likely is it that there may be some breakthrough in Geneva on Friday that diverts this crisis so that we're no longer heading toward what looks like military conflict?
Well, maybe I'll go first and Jim can have the last word. Tomorrow's not going to be the end of the play by any means. I think it will be a step along the road. I frankly am hopeful that it will be an opportunity to deliver some straight messages. Tony Blinken will have the opportunity to deliver some straight messages in a very, I would say, intensive way. And I hope they have an opportunity for some private conversation or in small group setting, because that's usually the best place to get your message across. And of course, Lavrov's going to have his share as well. But I take note of the fact, I take part, as many of you do, in a number of track 2 kinds of exercises, and they seem to be pointing in the direction of, discussions over the coming weeks. So I think that we will have more steps along the road. And as I said a moment ago, I really do think that there's going to be another round between the presidents. I've had no direct indication of that, but certainly the notion of some additional summitry or some additional president-to-president discussion and communication, I think that in a way that may be an opportunity to move this into a more positive space rather than, as we all hope, not going down the military route.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would just add, I mean, it's just interesting, the issue that was embedded in your question, Steve, about, the Russians put forward these very public demands and have been insisting on a written response from the United States and a written response from NATO. And I've been wondering whether or not, I mean, I'm not a big fan of doing that. So, in the context of these, very public demands the Russians have put forward. So I've been wondering whether or not the United States or NATO, is going to have some kind of written response. So I think if Secretary Blinken has said, don't plan on seeing him come with some big written response, I think that's a good thing. And I think he should be there to be prepared to say that he and the president and the rest of the administration and NATO are ready for serious negotiations if that's what the Russians want to engage in.
Okay, let me close with just one last question here. And it'll be a variation of my 1 to 5 scale. Let's project forward to March 1st. On March 1st, if number 1 is we're happily looking back and saying American and Western diplomacy was successful, we've steered the Russians to a path of a negotiation on the kind of issues that the West is prepared to negotiate on. That's number 1. Number 5 is diplomacy has failed and we have some Russian military action against Ukraine underway. Where would you put yourselves on that scale?
Well, I would put myself on the scale of it's still likelier, I think, that the Russians are going to engage in some kind of military action, but that doesn't mean you also still can't have diplomacy. So you could still have diplomacy, but in addition to all the other measures deterrent measures and punishments that will be imposed. But I think we're still in a situation where it's likelier that the Russians are going to do something militarily in Ukraine rather than not.
Rose?
Okay, well, Jim, if you're going to, I guess that puts you at a kind of 4 out of 5, right? On the military action side of the spectrum. I'm going to take 2 and stick, as is my wont, with the sincere hope in some continued work on the diplomatic track. And furthermore, don't forget that particular date you chose, Steve, is halfway between Russian Armed Forces Day at the end of February and International Women's Day on the 8th of March. And the Russians are usually in a festive mood during that period. So I'm not sure they're going to want to be invading anything right then.
Okay, I think probably analytically I'd come down a little bit closer to Jim, but I certainly, and I suspect, Jim, we certainly hope, Rose, that you are right and we are wrong. With apologies to those of you who I could not get to the questions, we will, as I said, be posting the recording of this on site if you wish to see it again. And let me express my gratitude to Rose and Jim for joining us for this conversation. I found it very useful. I learned a lot. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it was truly my pleasure. Great questions, everybody. Thank you.